Welcome to part 2 of CaFae Legends Fairies. Last week we discussed the origins of fairy lore and how they came from the Christianization of Celtic regions. Today we're picking up where we left off and seeing how the Victorian and television eras changed them even more. In terms of modern fairy traits, we've covered their vulnerability to iron, mischievous nature, glamour, timey-wimey fae realm, and changelings. We have yet to see any warnings about accepting gifts, eating their food, giving them your name, or the Seelie and Unseelie courts. We also have yet to meet a fairy with wings. In the 17th century, between the Renaissance period and Age of Enlightenment, there was a spike in religious fever in Europe and the colonies. Puritanism was founded and helped kick off a devastating civil war in Britain. Colonialism was getting big and thus required a ton of missionaries to help oppress these new native cultures, and King James was trying to put professional witch hunter on his resume. It was during this century that an English author and Oxford scholar, Robert Burton, wrote and published his Anatomy of Melancholy, which, among other things, described fairies as a kind of lesser demon. This belief was shared by most Puritans and even some Scottish Highlanders at the time and through the 19th century. Burton blamed fairies for shipwrecks, earthquakes, mine disasters, promoting paganism, even straight-up cannibalism. Now, Burton was not a Puritan. As far as we can tell, his religious views were moderate for the time. But Anatomy of Melancholy sold very well during his lifetime and continued to go strong in literary circles off and on through the 19th century. Whether this belief of fairies as demons was believed among the vast majority of illiterate people in Europe is difficult to say, especially since this is the same century where several manuscripts were printed and published with spells to gain control over fairies, usually involving incantations and wands of specific wood types. Some were kind of like exorcisms, with the idea being to dismiss them from places where they weren't wanted, but others were straight up asking for help and advice. Some of these spells are as old as the 15th century, but the fact that they were new ones being created and distributed during the same century as the Salem witch trials is darkly funny to me. This century is also when fairies started to be called names like the Good People or the Fair Folk. Robert Kirk was a 17th century Gaelic scholar who wrote The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies in 1691. Although it didn't get printed until 1815, the work was still relatively popular and talked enough about fairies that when his body was discovered in Aberfoyle, some people straight up believed that his body was a changeling, the type carved out of wood, and that the fairies had kidnapped Kirk for his insult of spying on them. You ever write about folklore so hard and so well that you become a part of it? Anyway, in his book, Kirk mentions that Irish fairies are called the Good People specifically out of fear of insulting them, which is not a good look for the fairies. The need to use euphemisms to talk about them has continued to this day as part of the "Dear God, please be polite to the Fae" rule that we mentioned last week. But it should be noted that even among educated authors, this dim, fearful view of fairies was not universal. Some were even turning them into the pure fantasy creatures that we in the modern day are a lot more familiar with. Marie Catherine Legumelle de Bonneville, the Baroness d'Aulnoy, aka Countess d'Aulnoy, was a 17th century French noblewoman and very popular author at the time, often called the Mother of Fairy Tales. She is the one who coined the term, as well as Prince Charming. Now, I took 5 years of French in grade school, but I can't remember more than a handful of phrases, so I had to read the English translation of her work. The earliest English copy I found was published in the 19th century, which means some things might have gotten rewritten or lost, so take this segment with a grain of salt. Fairies show up in almost every single one of d'Aulnoy's fairy tales, unsurprising as the original term Conte de Fées literally translates to stories of fairies. In blatant disregard of Burton's fairies or evil demons take, d'Aulnoy's fairies appear as both helping and hindering hands, put on the same moral spectrum as humans. In The Blue Bird, the evil princess has a fairy godmother. Literally, her family-appointed godmother is a fairy named Soussio, who demands both respect and that the king marry her goddaughter because he promised he would, although he only gave that promise because he thought he was talking to the princess's nicer and more attractive sister Florine. When he refuses to follow through with the rotten deal, Soussio turns him into a bird, but Soussio's sister, also a fairy, ends up helping Florine and getting the two star-crossed lovers back together. The story Griseos and Percinet has a literal fairy palace, and even though Percinet is never explicitly called a fairy, he has several fairy-like powers, including glamour, invisibility, and using a magic wand to get Griseos out of trouble. The only character explicitly called a fairy is hired by the evil stepmother to help her torment Griseos. But that fairy has a mini redemption arc at the end, apologizes to Griseos, and kills the evil queen in repentance. Also, that story maybe ends with Griseos dying? It has some of the fairy world is actually the afterlife flavor from older medieval lore. Princess Mayblossom has a Sleeping Beauty style christening where 5 good fairies bless the princess with beauty, singing, cleverness, etc., while the evil fairy Caraboss curses her to be miserable for the first 20 years of her life. She also has a magic wand that turns her dwarf servants into griffins, very classic, and injures, if not outright kills, the princess's wet nurses with bad luck. One is bit by a snake, the second attacked by an eagle, and the third trips into thorny bushes that pluck out her eyes. Why does Caraboss do all of this? Mayblossom's father played a single prank on her when he was a kid. So here we see fairies still in their moral gray area, still powerful and dangerous, occasionally pulling from older folklore like with the animal transformation wands, while fitting into more familiar fairy tale roles of either ally or villain. Reading Dolnoy's fairy tales felt like a trip back to childhood because even though the style of her writing went out of fashion soon after her death, there were a ton of familiar elements that Disney would later use as their building blocks: royalty, romance, magic, etc. But here's the thing about 17th century fairy tales. They were not designed for children. Dolnoy's stories were explicitly written for adults, and contemporary writers we have talk about these stories being told in the French court of King Louis XIV, and were enjoyed by almost everyone there. Court is not a place for children, it was very much an adults-only party. And yet the English translation that I found, published in 1892, makes it clear in the introduction that it is explicitly for children. So what happened between now and then that caused our idea of fairy tales to go from adult entertainment to nothing more than children's fantasies? That was a slow, gradual shift that began earlier in the 19th century. Fae lore remained largely localized during and after the medieval period. Most of the people who could read and write were located in larger cities, and even those that were, such as nobility, gentry, and clergy stationed in more rural posts, had other priorities for their limited supply of expensive paper and ink. So most contemporary folklore didn't get written down and remained largely oral. But the 19th century saw an explosion of books and articles written about the Fae, and most stories about the Fae that we're familiar with were written and published at this time. Why? Well, with the Age of Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution putting science and technology front and center, local traditions like the Fae were dismissed as dumb superstitions, slowly but surely being forgotten. The Romantic Revival was the pushback. Starting around the start of the 19th century and lasting about 50 years, the Romantic Revival as a cultural movement is difficult to give a quick description. It was mostly centered on the British Isles, but hit a lot of Europe and America. Basically, people were getting sick of what they saw as the over-industrialization of their home, especially the middle and working classes who had to go into the coal mines and work 12-hour shifts in dangerous factories. And so they became fascinated with stories and philosophy that underlined equal rights, social justice, and the natural world. It emphasized imagination, society and culture, passion, intuition, beauty, and all of those other pesky ideals that science has a hard time quantifying. The Romantic movement also looked at the past, a time before the factories and urbanization, through rose-colored lenses, particularly the medieval period, where a lot of Fae lore got started, and had a reverence for nature, the supernatural, and celebrating heroic deeds. This movement also helped trigger the Celtic Revival, which is a renewed interest in Celtic lore and culture, which included a lot of the stories about the Fae and their predecessors. That was a pretty obvious pushback against the surge of British colonialism, and sporadically waxed and waned from the 18th to 20th centuries. People like Joseph Campbell were especially annoyed at the oppression of Gaelic languages that had been going on at the time, and so sought out people who not only spoke the language, but also knew a lot about the traditions, history, and stories from that culture, so it had a shot at surviving British oppression. The Romantic movement and the Celtic Revival overlapped with and was followed up by the Victorian era, which saw both a boost in scientific and industrial advancement as well as a pushback to it. It's a fascinating phenomenon that you see all over history. Whenever something new comes out, a solid chunk of the population falls back on the old, be it technological or cultural. In this case, fascination with the occult, ghosts, and the supernatural spiked in the Victorian era, which included interest in fairies. And not everyone interested in the paranormal scoffed at or pushed back against science. For many, interest in science and fairies were one and the same. The new tech being invented and normalized looked and felt an awful lot like magic. Photography in the 1830s, the phonographs of the 1870s, moving pictures and x-rays of the 90s, all of which led to fresh questions about what else might exist beyond our human eyes. Add a printing press and a literary rate higher than it had ever been before, and you got the perfect environment for budding anthropologists and writers like the brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen to collect or straight up create fairy lore. Let's start with the Grimm family because they were right before Andersen and also didn't necessarily create anything. They just collected a bunch of stories in the brand new German state and published them in a search for cultural identity. Like their medieval forebears, the brothers Grimm seem allergic to using the word fae or fairy, at least as a noun. A variation of it comes up in The Nixie of the Mill Pond, where a fae-like nymph gives riches to a man in exchange for his son, though the man doesn't want to pay up. The son grows up, gets married, and then gets kidnapped by the Nixie, so his wife has to kidnap him back. A fairy circle is mentioned in the little folks' presents, although it's not magical, it's just a dance circle. These fairies willingly give gold to people who hang out with them once, but punish those greedy enough to come back for seconds. Their gifts also aren't obvious, disguising the gold as coals first, only for the glamour to fade away in the morning. Pretty much every other fae-like being in the Grimm stories is called an elf, dwarf, and witch, and they're almost interchangeable. A story called The Elves includes small, shy, largely benevolent beings who live in a timey-wimey hollow mountain. Staying there for 3 days is actually 7 years on the surface world. They also do a changeling swap. Rumpelstiltskin is a dwarf who makes an unfair deal with a desperate woman in exchange for her firstborn, but gets defeated when she learns his true name. And in the original Snow White and Rose Red story, the rude dwarf lives underground and steals treasure from others, bearing a fae-like resemblance to living underground with a bunch of shiny things. Sometimes they're villains, sometimes they help the heroes, sometimes they start antagonistic and end up as allies, but for the most part, they're story props. Just a few years after the Grimm brothers published their findings, Hans Christian Andersen started publishing his own work. Some of it was fairy tale rewrites, but there was a lot of original stuff too that made its way into canon. And this includes the earliest story that I could find that puts a fairy as the main character. Although again, they're not called fairies. The pixie and the gardener's wife has a tiny fairy who's angry that he's not believed in and that he's not getting offerings of porridge the way his ancestors did for helping out around the house. This is a clear reference to older fae lore that talked about small, invisible fairies doing household chores for families who left them porridge or milk or some other gift, a belief that was waning at the time. But after a series of misunderstandings, the pixie overhears the wife share a poem that he believes is for and about him, and decides to stick around and remain helpful to the house rather than prank them out of vengeance. This is a trend with a lot of Andersen stories involving fairies. The Rose Elf goes from total hermit to going out of his way to ensure a human's murder is avenged. The pixie at the grocer's deals with the very classic artist dilemma of helping the grocer in exchange for steady income of porridge versus wanting to study poetry. And while the Hill of the Elves has no plot, just vibes, each of the fae creatures have personality and are distinct from each other. Pre-Andersen, fairies were either plot devices or forces of nature, not actual people. They were metaphors, symbols. People disappear in forests all the time, as I said last week. Having them stumble into the paradise, a land of fairy, never to return, was often seen as a metaphor for dying and going to heaven. But Andersen's fairies are not forces of nature or handy tools for human protagonists. They're people with dreams, flaws, and arcs, and I think he was the first to do that consistently. Most other fae don't get arcs or center stage before Andersen, but after, well, his idea of putting fairies in the center stage proved to be a short-lived trend until at least the 20th century. Another major change that happened to fairies at this time was wings. Prior to the 18th century, fairies were never depicted with wings. Whenever they could fly, it was with an enchanted object or by transforming into a bird. But late 18th and early 19th century art and theater production showed them more and more often with wings, and the Victorian era especially saw them become softer, more childlike in appearance, likely reflecting and contributing to the childification of their stories. Exactly why they got wings is unclear. Maybe it was to signify to the audience or viewer that they were otherworldly. Maybe it was because it made sense for the smaller pixie-sized fairies to get around and disappear so quickly. Maybe it's because wings are dope. Why do you think the chimera in my sci-fi novel have wings? It's not just plot convenience, it's a killer aesthetic. Interest in fairies and their lore continued to grow throughout the 19th century, as early anthropologists like Thomas Crofton Crocker, Joseph Campbell, and John Rice went into Ireland and Wales published their findings on local fairy lore, preferably before it got completely wiped out through the double whammy of British colonialism and industrialization. Although it should be noted that Crocker lost all of his notes after his journey, so he and his friends had to reconstruct the stories from memory. He's also been criticized by many Irish for anglifying and distorting Irish culture, even patronizingly, which is not a baseless argument. He even says in the preface that he improved the tales. John Rice isn't much better, calling the stories he collected from Wales heathen lore and superstition. But one thing I will give Crocker credit for is actually using the word fairy on a regular basis instead of elf or dwarf. It took over 8 centuries, but we got there. His work also, to my knowledge, includes the earliest story I could find that explicitly warns against the dangers of eating food prepared by fairies, although this one is more about avoiding payment and free fairy gifts than the food and drink itself. In Master and Man, a man named Billy drinks a glass of liquor from a fairy, makes the mistake of refusing to pay him, and is instead forced to work for the fairy for 7 years and a day. This fairy is very careful to make no other bargains with Billy, or give gifts or favors outside of the defined service, which does include paying Billy for his services with more booze during those 7 years. One time Billy says, "Well pleased I will be with your service if you continue to give me plenty to drink," to which the fairy replies, "I have made no bargain with you, and will make none." So basically, the fairy is happy to trap Billy into employment through free booze, as well as keep paying him with alcohol during those 7 years, but refuses to lock himself into any sort of verbal contract. Their working relationship stays positive until the fairy decides to try to steal a young bride to marry himself, which Billy prevents by saying "God bless you" when someone sneezes, because fairies still have more in common with demons than angels. Meanwhile, John Rice's work focused more on Wales and mainland Britain, and included a local Manx legend about fairy food. A man walking alone at night heard the sound of fairy music, followed it, and ended up wandering into a fairy hall in the mountains. A banquet was happening. There were no fairies, but there were several faces which he seemed to know, but no act of mutual recognition took place. As someone who is god-awful at both names and faces, I feel you, bro. Anyway, the people the man sorta kinda maybe recognized don't say anything until he's offered something to drink, at which point they warned him not to taste of the drink if he had any wish to make his way home again. If he partook of it, he would become like one of them. So he accidentally spills his drink, and the hall and all of its inmates instantly vanish. John Rice notes that this is apparently a widely held belief and was even noted in an earlier book published by a colleague of his, Primitive Culture by Professor Edward Tyler back in 1871. Just in case we were confused on the scholars' attitudes toward their subjects and source materials. But we can gather from this that by the late 19th century, the "don't eat fairy food" rule was carved in stone, showing up in almost every anthropologist's work whenever they asked anyone about fairies. One of the more terrifying versions was written by Lady Wilde in Ancient Legends of Ireland in 1887. A young woman is enticed into a fairy dance, and after she dances with the prince, she's taken to a banquet, and I'm just gonna let the story speak for itself here. She took the golden cup the prince handed to her and raised it to her lips to drink. Just then a man passed close to her and whispered, "Eat no food and drink no wine, or you will never reach your home again." So she laid down the cup and refused to drink. On this they were angry, and a great noise arose, and a fierce, dark man stood up and said, "Whoever comes to us must drink with us." And he seized her arm and held the wine to her lips so that she almost died of fright. But at that moment a red-haired man came up, and he took her by the hand and led her out. "You are safe for this time," he said. "Take this herb and hold it in your hand till you reach home, and no one can harm you." And he gave her a branch of ground ivy. This she took and fled away in the dark night, but all the time she heard footsteps behind her in pursuit. At last she reached home and barred the door and went to bed, when a great clamor arose outside, and voices were heard, crying to her, "The power we have over you is gone through the magic of the herb. But wait, when you dance again to the music on the hill, you will stay with us forevermore, and none shall hinder." However, she kept the magic branch safely, and the fairies never troubled her more. But it was a long and long before the sound of fairy music left her ears, which she had danced to that November night on the hillside with her fairy lover. Seriously? Red flag. We don't know exactly when that belief of fairy food trapping you in their world started, seeing as it never appeared in any of the earlier works I plowed through. There are a handful of medieval stories, such as St. Colin of the 7th century, who sees through the fairy glamour and knows the bountiful food at the feast laid out for him is actually just leaves. Definitely not something you should eat, but it's never explicitly stated that eating or drinking anything will trap you there forever until the 19th century scholars came out in force. But given the trope's popularity, it's not surprising that it got folded into the lore. It appears as early as Greek mythology's Persephone eating a pomegranate in the underworld, thus ensuring that she's got to spend at least half of her time there. With the world getting smaller and technology getting better at spreading those kinds of ideas across the world, it's no wonder that it merged with fairies and has persisted as a defining feature of modern fae lore, especially when paired with changelings. Although the warning against eating fairy food really only works when you're on their turf. J.G. Campbell recorded how Scottish fairies will borrow oatmeal from humans and return double measure of barley meal. And Worcestershire fairies will bake small, delicious cakes for the mortals who help them out. Worcestershire? Speaking of food and deals, other bits of fairy lore have to do with being careful with their gifts after receiving them. Some of Rice's legends talk about families who would let fairies, usually of the smaller size, bathe in their house, and the fairies would leave behind a bit of gold as thanks and fair payment. But if you told anyone about it, they'd stop coming and stop leaving you gifts. Irish fairies, according to Crocker, are usually described as very small. They usually wear little red nightcaps similar to mushrooms, and because of their size, they can usually blend in with those surroundings and pass themselves off as mushrooms. Add in the traditional dancing circle with those mushroom disguises, and you've got yourself a fairy ring. The Welsh stories that John Rice collected are a bit different. Many of these fairies are human-sized, and he noted several families who claim descent from them, and this is where we get more stories of the fairy wife that we talked about in Walter Mapp's De Nugis Curialium. Versions of the story proliferated in the intervening centuries, but didn't change all that much. One additional detail that sometimes got added to this kind of story is that if the man kidnaps the fairy to be his wife, she'll often refuse to give in, stating that she'll only marry him if she can guess her true name. Her kidnapper will then have the good luck of overhearing some of his captive relatives talk about her, dropping her name in the process, which he then uses on her. Then she'll agree to the marriage, given her usual rule of no hitting with iron, which inevitably gets broken a few years later. Earlier ideas of the Fae also got cemented into public consciousness, such as changelings and the timey-wiminess of the Fae realm. With changelings, if your child got swapped, then one trick was to have everyone in the family throw a piece of iron at the changeling, convincing the Fae of their intention of killing it. The changeling will then supposedly be swapped out for the family's true baby. You can also check to see if your kid is a changeling by taking a dozen eggs and brewing ale or beer in the shells. This is supposed to get the changeling to actually speak, usually something along the lines of, "I have seen the first acorn before the oak, but I have never seen brewing done in eggshells before," which is usually above the language skills of a toddler. Now, onto the timey-wimey. One of Crocker's stories tells of Rice, not the author, just some workhand, and Llewellyn, a Welsh folktale where the two men are trudging home with their horses after a long day of work when Rice hears some music on a little plain. Llewellyn can't hear anything, but Rice insists that he has to go dancing right now. He tells Llewellyn to take the rest of the horses home with him. Llewellyn tries to stop him, but Rice goes running off. Not wanting to get in trouble with his boss or family, Llewellyn takes the horses home, goes to the bar, and has a drink. But Rice doesn't come home for days. The townspeople get suspicious, even accuse Llewellyn of murder. But thankfully, a farmer figures out what happened and asks Llewellyn to lead him and some other men to where Rice disappeared. When he does, one of the men hears music, and a farmer sees that his foot is just inside the wide circle of mushrooms, aka a fairy circle. When the men all lock arms, they can hear the music too. Even better, they can see the fairies, small enough to be children about 3 or 4 years old, with Rice dancing among them. The men grab Rice and haul him away, and Rice is pissed. He'd only been there for 5 minutes. Then there's another story, although it's hard to get an exact date, where a hunchback is wandering around the outskirts of his town and hears fairies singing by the river. He stops to listen and, when there's a break in the song, joins in, improving their melody. The fairies are so impressed that they magically remove his hunch. Word of this spreads, and another hunchback decides to try his luck to get his disability removed, going to the exact same spot by the river. But instead of politely waiting for a break in the song, he interrupts them, blurting out a few words and notes. The fairies are unimpressed and drop the first hunchback's hunch onto his shoulders, making his condition twice as worse. He dies within a year. This meant almost everything in modern fae lore, both what we got in medieval times and also what we didn't see back then. Be wary of gifts, the glamour, the underground dwelling with possible time change issues, and a warning to be polite. Even the name thing is alluded to with stories like Rumpelstiltskin. Modern fae lore warns against giving the fairies your real name, because then they can use it to control you. Or if you're in my CaFae Latte world, they can curse or bless you. But if you manage to get the fairy's name, then you have control over them. We see notes of that in Rice's version of the fairy wife, although it's never said in so many words. A lot of ancient religions that influenced Fae lore, like Greek mythology, explicitly warns against calling upon certain deities by their name unless you truly want their attention. And a lot of Abrahamic lore states that you can summon and control demons if you know their true name. So it's not much of a stretch to assume that somewhere in the 19th and 20th centuries, names became much more significant to fairies. There's one thing about fairies that we haven't seen from folklore and scholarly accounts, and that is the Seelie and Unseelie courts. They're a huge part of modern Fae lore, particularly in Scotland. The idea is simple. Most, if not all, fairies are in one of two camps: the relatively good-natured and benevolent Seelie, and the actively malicious Unseelie. You still have to be careful about not throwing insults or your name or taking gifts and food, but if you're gonna wander into mushroom circles, be sure to pick the one that leads you to the Seelie court. Your chances of having a good time and coming back in one piece are astronomically better. But why didn't they show up in the findings of Rice and Crocker and the like? Well, that's because this idea about two fairy courts is not that old. They might have been inspired by the Twededannen and Firbolg split, or the light and dark elves from Norse mythology. The idea of two distinct types of Fae-like entities is very old and is baked into a lot of Fae lore and shows up everywhere in pre-Christian European religion. But the earliest written mention we have of the Seelies is from a theologian named William Hay in the 16th century, 400 years after the Book of Invasion was written down and well into the Renaissance period. Hay complained about witches meeting with fairies that he called Seelie Witches, which I'm probably mispronouncing. The Seelie here is not referencing any court, it's the Scottish word for lucky or happy, and is where we get the English word silly. The first mention we have of Seelie and Unseelie courts, written down anyway, is the Ballad of Alison Gross, a story of an ugly witch who falls in love with a man and, when he rejects her, turns him into a dragon. His sister tries to help him, but he's ultimately saved by the Seelie court, whose fairy queen was in a benevolent mood and turns him back into human. But this play wasn't written until around 1783, and I didn't find any references to the courts in my 19th century sources. The earliest scholarly reference I could find was Primitive Beliefs in the Northeast of Scotland, written by J.M. McPherson in 1929, making the Seelie and Unseelie courts a very new idea in the life of fairy lore. I ultimately decided against using the Seelie-Unseelie division in my own stories for the simple reason that you can't really fit vast groups of people into one of two neat categories. People are a lot more complex than that. By the turn of the century, belief in fairies was mostly gone, though you still had stories pop up now and then. Sherlock Holmes creator Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wholeheartedly believed in fairies, which damaged his reputation. And in 1895, a young Irish woman named Bridget Cleary was burned alive by her husband, who believed she had been swapped by a changeling. And so fairies entered and largely stayed in the world of fiction. With all the folklore being spread about them, authors were able to pick and choose which parts they liked and ignore what they didn't. And what they most often didn't like was the scary stuff, the kidnapping and killing and cursing. Instead, they were more like dull noise fairies, some good, some bad, but even those cursed by fairies were able to walk it off. Fairies and fairy tales slid more and more into the children's section, and not just because fairies were being declawed. Literary snobbery has been around as long as literature. If you like reading at any point in history, there are people who look down on you for your tastes, and the roots are usually in sexism and/or classism. In this case, classism, for two reasons. Number one, the stories themselves originated from poorer places. They were passed down by and repeated to the working poor, sometimes in cities, but especially in rural Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Three places that the world, and especially Britain, has a long history of looking down on. You'll recall Rice and Crocker's superiority complex about these stories and the people telling them. And number two, the stories themselves were told and written in very simple prose and style. There are very few, if any, instances where you have to crack open a dictionary to understand the words used, so that made them great reads for not just poorer audiences who couldn't afford expensive literary educations, but also children. Add to that the waning belief in the Fae themselves, pushing them from history and cultural studies to straight up fantasy, and of course people are going to look down on these stories, and they'll make their opinions heard. In John Rice's preface, he derides those who may think that the legends here reported are childish and frivolous, which indicates that dismissive attitudes towards fairies and lore was prominent at the time, or at least he bumped into it often enough that he felt the need to address it. And because these stories were seen as more and more suited for children, this meant that new fairy tales and stories about fairies were being written for children, turning reputation into fact. Now, this doesn't mean that fairies were completely excluded from scarier, more adult stories, such as Evan Wenz's depiction of fairies drinking the blood of humans if a bowl of water wasn't left out for them. That was published in 1911, but that became something of the exception, not the norm, especially when we got Tinkerbell. Tinkerbell first appeared in 1904 when James M. Barrie wrote a play and later novelization, Peter Pan, which was so whimsical and nonsensical, even with some of the horrible stuff that happens, that it's clearly designed for kids. The play and book were then adopted by Walt Disney in 1953, and like everything else Disney does, their portrayal became the standard. In both book and movie, Tinkerbell is tiny, she glows, and is incredibly mercurial. The book version attributes her mood swings to her size, stating that she can only feel one emotion at a time, and this makes her both an ally and an enemy. Though her loyalty is to Peter Pan and she saves his life, in the book by drinking poison meant for him, in the movies by warning him of a bomb that's about to blow up, she tries to kill Wendy out of jealousy. She can also, notably, lie. She tells the Lost Boys that Peter Pan wants them to shoot down Wendy, even when she knows he very much does not want that to happen. This is the earliest story I could find where the fairy knowingly says an outright falsehood, although it should also be noted that they found a single line of text in the 12th century manuscript stating that fairies hate lies. Not that they couldn't do it, just that they wouldn't. Frankly, I think Peter Pan is more Fae-like than Tinkerbell. He never grows old, unlike Tinkerbell, who explicitly dies of old age in the book. He's a trickster, he and Captain Hook both follow the letter of their word in their man-to-man fight, and Captain Hook's bombing of the tree is done explicitly because he swore not to lay a hand or a hook on Peter Pan. And in the book specifically, Peter is very reluctant to let the darling siblings go. He even flies ahead of them on their return journey to lock the windows and make them think that their parents don't want them back. But then he sees how distressed their mother is and lets them go. Letting go is another theme that we need to look at. The book and especially the movie equate belief in fairies and magic as childlike, and that letting go of those beliefs is one of the first steps toward adulthood and growing up, thus further cementing fairies and their stories in the realm of childhood rather than a genuine belief system in ancient folklore. Although even Disney couldn't completely shed some of the OG folklore. How many people have equated Peter Pan with the Grim Reaper and Neverland, the place where nobody grows old, to the afterlife? Because of Disney's impact, Tinkerbell is the first thing we tend to think of when we hear the word fairy. We think of wings and small size and helpful friendly creatures. We also think of the three good fairies from Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella's fairy godmother. Maybe Maleficent too, but she's the exception, not the rule. Thus, that's the image that most modern storytellers push back on when undermining the fairy trope. Most modern stories about fairies and fae are paranormal romances, usually a young woman falling for an ancient fae man, but we do occasionally get a good old-fashioned horror story. Whenever a modern author uses the word fae, it can mean anything. Wings, no wings, magician or warrior, sometimes they can lie, sometimes they can't or won't, sometimes they're child-friendly, sometimes they're smutty, they're probably immortal, but they span the whole moral spectrum. The options are limitless. And that's what tends to happen with the age of the internet. We've compiled so much information about these creatures and stories that authors have the luxury of cherry-picking whatever works best for their story, or to just straight up make new rules. And as an author, there's literally no better playground. So that's the history of fairy lore. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you next week. Bye, lovelies.
In the forest deep, where shadows fall, there's a queen who stands so proud and tall. Her throne of whispers, her kingdom's call, with dragons fierce who hearken all. Through the misty woods her anthem rings, a symphony of wild and wondrous things, with scales and wings and ancient kings. She's the spirit of forgotten springs. Raise your voice like a dragon's roar. Queens of old, we will be no more. In our hearts we feel the core, strength and power forevermore. Beneath the moon, with stars so bright, she dances in the silver light. Her gaze is sharp, her spirit might, a queen who guards the forest night. Through shadows deep, through oceans wide, her echoes heard on every tide. In legend now tide. With a gaze like embers burning gold, she leads her tales of legends told. Her story's one of courage bold. In songs of old she will unfold. Raise your voice like a dragon's roar. Queens of old, we will be no more. In our hearts we feel the core, strength and power forevermore. Beneath the moon with stars so bright, she dances in the silver light. Her gaze is sharp, her spirit might, a queen who guards the forest.